He thought it was just another routine call. Nothing unusual, nothing urgent, just paperwork and maybe a warning. But then he looked closer. At first, everything seemed normal. Two young sisters sitting quietly. No chaos, no screaming, no obvious emergency. And that's exactly what made it strange. The older girl didn't move much. The younger one wouldn't stop holding on to her. The officer had handled hundreds of calls like this before, but something felt off. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, and sometimes subtle is worse. When his eyes shifted downward, his entire expression changed. This was no longer routine. This was serious. And what he did next may have saved everything. Chapter 1. The Look That Changed Everything. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights of Hadley's family grocery hummed quietly above the cereal aisle as Daniel Harper made his way through the store. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Slow, ordinary, the kind of day that fades into the next without leaving a mark. Daniel was 62 years old, broad shoulders that carried 30 years of service, first in the Navy, then as a community officer in the small town of Mill Haven, Indiana. He knew this store the way he knew most things in this town, by name, by habit, by the tiny details most people walked right past. He nodded to Mr. Elwood at the bakery counter, held the door for a woman with a double stroller, checked the time, 3:47 p.m., and then he saw her. She was sitting on a wooden bench near the checkout lanes. A teenager, 16 at most, with dark circles under her eyes and a winter coat that was a size too small. She was visibly pregnant, far along. Her hands rested flat on her knees, perfectly still. But it wasn't her stillness that stopped Daniel cold. It was the little girl beside her, 4 years old maybe, tiny. She was crying, not loudly, not in the way children cry for candy or attention. She was crying quietly, with her whole body trembling, and between soft sobs, she kept whispering the same word over and over. Sorry, sorry, sorry. Like she believed her own tears were something to be ashamed of. Daniel had spent decades learning to read people. He had seen exhaustion. He had seen fear. He had seen the particular kind of stillness that comes when someone has been strong for so long, they forgot how to ask for help. The teenager wasn't looking at anyone, wasn't looking at the little girl beside her. She stared at a fixed point on the floor, eyes open but somewhere far away. Daniel approached slowly, calmly, the way you approach someone standing too close to the edge of something. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Is everything okay over here?" The girl blinked. It took a moment, like she was returning from somewhere else entirely. "We're fine," she said, flat, practiced. Daniel crouched down to the little girl's level. "Hey there, sweetheart. What's your name?" The child looked up at him with wet eyes. "Lily," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name." He smiled gently. "Are you okay, Lily?" Lily looked at the teenager beside her, as if asking for permission to answer. Then she looked back at Daniel and gave the smallest shake of her head. "No." Daniel stood slowly and looked at the teenager again. "I'm Officer Harper. I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want to make sure you two are all right." For a long moment she said nothing. Then quietly, so quietly he almost missed it, "We just needed a few things from the store." It was a simple sentence. But the way she said it, the weight behind it, the exhaustion, the careful measurement of every word, told Daniel that a few things meant something much bigger than groceries. He glanced toward the checkout counter. A basket sat near the register. Formula, a small bottle of children's medicine, and one prescription bag with a name he couldn't quite read from where he stood. He looked back at the girl. Her eyes had returned to that fixed point on the floor. And in 30 years of service, in every difficult moment he had ever walked into, Daniel Harper had learned one thing above all else. When a child apologizes for crying, something is very wrong. He pulled up a chair from a nearby display and sat beside them. Not hovering, not rushing, just present. "I've got time," he said simply. "No hurry." Lily stopped trembling. Just slightly. Just enough. And the teenager, for the first time, looked directly at him. What Daniel didn't know yet was that behind those quiet eyes was a story that would change his life forever. And it all started with what was sitting in that basket at the register. Chapter 2. More Than a Grocery Run. The girl's name was Emily Turner. She didn't offer it easily. Daniel had to earn it, with patience, with silence, with the kind of stillness that told her he wasn't going anywhere until he knew she was okay. They sat together near the checkout lane for a few minutes before she spoke again. Lily had stopped whispering her quiet apologies and was now leaning against Emily's arm, eyes half closed, thumb near her mouth. "She's tired," Emily said almost to herself. "Looks like you both are," Daniel replied. No judgment, just truth. Emily glanced at him sideways, then, slowly, she nodded. She told him her name. Nothing else at first. But Daniel had learned long ago that silence, when held gently, eventually fills itself. "We live on Elm Creek Road," she finally said, "with our grandmother. Just the three of you?" A pause. "Yes." Daniel looked toward the register again. The basket was still sitting on the counter. The cashier, a young woman named Tara who had worked there for years, caught Daniel's eye and gave him a small, uncertain look. He walked to the counter quietly. The items were simple: a can of infant formula, a bottle of children's cough syrup, and a prescription bag. The total on the screen read $31.40. Emily had placed $22 on the counter. She was $9 short, and from the way she was staring at her hands when he returned, she had already decided which item to put back. Daniel reached into his pocket without a word. He placed a $10 bill on the counter and nodded to Tara. "Sir, you don't have to—" Emily started. "I know," he said simply. "I wanted to." She looked at him for a long moment. Not with suspicion. She was too tired for suspicion. She looked at him the way someone looks at a kindness they had stopped expecting. Outside, the afternoon air was cold and sharp. Daniel carried the bag while Emily held Lily against her side. They walked to a car that had seen better years, a dented sedan with a cracked taillight and a back seat full of folded blankets. He put the bag gently on the back seat and noticed the blankets, noticed the empty water bottles, noticed the small drawing taped to the glove compartment, a child's crayon sketch of 3 figures holding hands. He didn't say anything about any of it, but his mind was already working quietly, the way it always did when something didn't add up. "Is your grandmother home right now?" he asked. Emily buckled Lily into a car seat held together with a replacement strap. "She's always home." "Does she have help? Anyone checking in on her?" Emily's hand slowed for just a moment on the buckle. Then she finished and closed the door. "We manage," she said. It was the same tone as before, practiced, careful, the tone of someone who had said those 2 words so many times they had worn smooth like riverstone. Daniel handed her the car keys she had left on the roof without realizing. She looked at them in her hand, then up at him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." "Of course," he paused. "Emily, I do welfare checks in this area on Thursdays. Would it be all right if I stopped by? Just to say hello?" She studied him for a moment, a long, careful moment. Then she nodded. Once. She drove away slowly, the sedan's engine knocking softly as it turned onto the main road. Daniel stood in the parking lot and watched until the car disappeared. Lily's crayon drawing stayed in his mind. 3 figures, 3 people holding hands. And something about the way that little girl had whispered sorry over and over, like she had been taught, without anyone saying a word, that her needs were too much. That stayed with him even longer. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. But what Daniel would find on Elm Creek Road on Thursday would be far more than he had prepared himself for. Chapter 3. The House on Elm Creek Road. Thursday came with a gray sky and a wind that cut through jackets like it had somewhere important to be. Daniel turned onto Elm Creek Road at 2:30. He had driven this street hundreds of times over the years, knew every pothole, every leaning mailbox, every house that needed a coat of paint but never seemed to get one. Number 114 sat at the end of a gravel driveway. A small white house with a porch that sagged slightly on the left side. A plastic lawn chair sat near the front door, turned toward the yard as if someone had been sitting there recently, watching the world go by. Daniel parked and sat for a moment. There was a light on inside. That was something. He knocked gently. Footsteps. A pause. Then the door opened and Emily stood there, one hand on the frame, eyes moving quickly from his face to the street behind him and back again. "You came," she said, not warmly, not coldly, just surprised. "I said I would," Daniel replied. She stepped back and let him in. The house was clean. That was the first thing he noticed, and it moved him more than disorder would have, because keeping a home clean under those circumstances took a kind of quiet determination that most people never had to find. But the cold was impossible to ignore. He could see his own breath. "Heating system," Emily said, noticing his expression. "It's been off for about 2 weeks." She said it plainly, no drama, just a fact she had learned to live beside. The living room was small. A couch with a blanket folded neatly over the back. A television that looked older than Emily. A side table with a glass of water and 2 pill bottles. One empty, one almost there. And in the armchair by the window sat Margaret. She was 78 years old, with white hair pinned loosely at the back of her head, and hands folded in her lap like a woman who had spent a lifetime being composed. She looked up when Daniel entered, and her face, for just a moment, shifted into something warm and open. "Oh," she said softly. "Company." She smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Margaret, this is Officer Harper," Emily said carefully. "He's a friend." The word seemed to surprise Emily as she said it, like she hadn't planned it but couldn't find a more accurate one. "Well, any friend of Emily's," Margaret said, gesturing to the couch with quiet elegance, "is very welcome in this house." Daniel sat. He stayed for 40 minutes. Margaret talked about the garden she used to keep, about a blueberry pie she was known for in the neighborhood, about a dog named Chester, who had been gone for years, but whom she still mentioned in the present tense. Emily sat across the room, quiet, watching her grandmother with eyes full of something Daniel recognized, the particular tenderness of someone carrying a truth they're not ready to share. When Margaret dozed off mid-sentence, Emily walked Daniel to the door. Outside on the cold porch, Daniel spoke quietly. "How long has she been like this?" Emily crossed her arms against the cold. "It comes and goes. Some days she's completely herself. Other days—" She stopped. "Other days she thinks it's 30 years ago." Daniel nodded slowly. "Is she taking her medication regularly?" "When we have it." He glanced back through the window. Margaret was asleep in the armchair, her hands still folded, her face peaceful. Then Daniel noticed something near the kitchen doorway. The stove. One of the burners had a faint blue flicker, barely visible, barely there. A pilot light that hadn't fully caught. The faint, unmistakable trace of something in the air. "Emily." His voice was calm but direct. "When did you last check the stove?" She turned, looked, and in that half-second before she moved toward the kitchen, Daniel saw it, the flash of recognition in her eyes. She knew. She had known for a while, and she had been managing it, quietly, alone, the way she managed everything else. The stove was just one thing on a list that was growing longer by the day, and Daniel was beginning to understand that Emily hadn't been surviving. She had been holding everything together with bare hands, and she was running out of strength. Chapter 4. What Margaret Remembers. Daniel fixed the stove burner himself before he left that Thursday. It took 20 minutes, a small toolkit he kept in his patrol car, and very little conversation. Emily stood nearby and watched him work with the careful attention of someone filing away information they might need later. When it was done, she made instant coffee, the cheap kind, the kind that comes in a jar, and handed him a mug without asking if he wanted one. He took it. They sat at the kitchen table while Lily napped on the couch and Margaret slept in her armchair. "She wasn't always like this," Emily said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her grandmother through the doorway. 2 years ago, she was still driving, still making Sunday dinners. She remembered everything. "What changed?" Daniel asked. "Everything changed all at once." A pause. That's how it happens, I think. Not slowly. All at once. Daniel wrapped both hands around the warm mug and waited. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She raised my mom here, in this house, just the two of them mostly." Her voice was steady but carefully so. "My mom had a hard time for a while. Margaret never gave up on her. Kept the door open, always. She sounds like a strong woman. The strongest I've ever known." Emily finally looked at him. "That's why it's hard to watch. She spent her whole life being the one who remembered everything. Every birthday, every important day, every promise she ever made. And now—" She stopped. Daniel nodded. He didn't rush her. "She called me by my mom's name last week," Emily said quietly. "She held my hand and told me she was proud of me. And I didn't correct her." She looked down at her coffee. "Is that wrong?" "No," Daniel said. "That's love." Emily was quiet for a moment. From the living room came a soft sound. Margaret shifting in her chair, murmuring something half-formed. Emily was on her feet before the sound finished, moving to her grandmother with a practiced ease that broke Daniel's heart a little. He stayed in the doorway. Margaret opened her eyes and looked around the room with the particular confusion of someone trying to find their footing in a place that keeps shifting. Then her gaze landed on Emily and something in her settled. "There you are," Margaret said softly. "Here I am," Emily answered. Margaret reached up and touched Emily's face with one hand. "You look tired, sweetheart." "I'm okay, Grandma." "You don't have to say that." Margaret's voice was gentle but clear. "Not to me." Emily took her grandmother's hand and held it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Daniel watched from the doorway and felt something shift quietly inside him. He thought of Rebecca, of a night years ago when she had come to him needing exactly this, someone to sit beside her without trying to fix anything, and he had offered solutions instead of presence, advice instead of stillness. He had been so sure that helping meant solving. He was only beginning to understand the difference. Before he left, Margaret looked across the room and noticed him again, as if seeing him for the first time. "Are you a good man?" she asked, directly, without apology. Daniel paused. "I'm trying to be." Margaret considered this for a moment. Then she nodded as if it were the only right answer. "That's all any of us can do," she said. Daniel drove home that evening in silence. He didn't turn on the radio. He just drove and thought about a 78-year-old woman who still had the clarity, even on her hardest days, to ask the only question that mattered. And he thought about whether he could honestly say the answer was yes. Chapter 5. The Weight She Carries Alone. Daniel came back the following Tuesday. He told himself it was a routine check. That was what he wrote in his notes. Routine welfare visit, Elm Creek Road. But he knew, the way you always know when you're not being entirely honest with yourself, that it was something more than that. Emily opened the door before he knocked. She had heard the patrol car on the gravel. Lily was awake this time, sitting on the kitchen floor with a coloring book and 3 crayons, red, blue, and a brown one worn down to almost nothing. She looked up at Daniel, studied him for a moment with serious eyes, and then went back to her drawing without a word. Margaret was having a harder morning. She was in her room, resting. Emily had left the door slightly open so she could hear her. They sat at the kitchen table again. This time, Emily talked. Not all at once, not easily, but steadily, the way water finds its way through stone. Slow and quiet and impossible to stop once it starts. She told him she had been in 10th grade when everything changed, that she had been a decent student, that she had liked history class, of all things, the way it made sense of why the world was the way it was. She told him her father had never been a real presence, a name on a form, nothing more. She told him about her mother, carefully with measured words, that she had struggled, that she had tried, that she had eventually needed help that the family didn't know how to give, that she was somewhere getting that help now, far away, out of contact. She said all of this without bitterness. That was the part that stayed with Daniel. No anger, just an exhausted kind of acceptance that she had arrived at long before she should have had to. "And the baby's father?" Daniel asked gently. Emily looked at the table. "He was older. He said he wanted to help us, that he had a plan." A pause. When I told him about the baby, he stopped returning my calls. She said it the same way she said everything, plainly, without decoration. I'm sorry, Emily, Daniel said. She shrugged slightly. I don't have time to be sad about it. From the bedroom, Margaret called out softly, a question directed at no one in particular, something about whether the windows were closed. Emily was up and down the hallway before Daniel had finished setting down his mug. He heard her voice, low and calm, reassuring her grandmother, heard Margaret settle. Emily came back and sat down. She picked up her coffee cup, put it down without drinking. I'm not telling you all this because I want help, she said. She looked at him directly now. I want you to know I'm not looking for someone to rescue us. We've been managing. I know you have, Daniel said. I can see that clearly. Then why do you keep coming back? It was a fair question, honest and direct the way Emily was honest and direct about everything. Daniel thought about it for a moment before answering. Because managing isn't the same as being okay, he said, and you deserve more than just managing. Emily looked at him for a long time. Lily held up her coloring book from the floor, a drawing of a house, filled in carefully with the red crayon, a yellow sun in the corner that took up nearly half the page. That's our house, Lily said proudly. Daniel looked at the drawing. The house was bright red. The sun was enormous, and standing in front of it were 3 small figures, the same 3 figures he had seen in the crayon drawing taped to the car's glove compartment. It's beautiful, he said. Lily nodded seriously. I know. Emily looked at her little sister for a moment, and something in her face softened. Just slightly. Just enough. Daniel left that morning with more than he had come with. And for the first time in a long time, so did Emily. But what neither of them knew was that someone else had been paying attention to that house on Elm Creek Road, and not with kindness. Chapter 6. Daniel's Own Ghosts. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea he forgot to drink. The house was quiet in the way that only empty houses are quiet. Not peaceful, but hollow. The kind of silence that has a shape to it. He lived alone. Had lived alone for 3 years since Carol passed. His wife had filled a room just by being in it, not with noise, but with presence. The particular warmth of someone who always knew when to speak and when to simply stay close. He missed that most. Not the conversations, the staying close. He looked at the photograph on the shelf across the room. Carol on the left, him on the right, and between them a teenage girl with his jaw and her mother's eyes, laughing at something just outside the frame. Rebecca. She was 34 now, lived in Cincinnati. They spoke, if you could call it that, a few times a year. Brief calls, careful words. The kind of conversations that stay near the surface because both people are afraid of what lies underneath. It had started, the distance, when Rebecca was 17. She had come to him one evening, nervous in the way teenagers are nervous when they need to say something important. She had sat at this very table, in the chair where Emily had sat just days ago, and she had told him she was pregnant. Daniel had not been cruel. He had not raised his voice, but he had said the wrong things, practical things, concerned things, things that were really about his own fear dressed up as wisdom. He had talked about plans and decisions and futures, when what his daughter had needed in that moment was simply for her father to say, I love you. We'll figure this out together. He hadn't said that. Rebecca had lost the baby a few weeks later. A miscarriage early. The kind of loss that people sometimes dismiss because it happened quietly, without much time having passed. But Rebecca didn't dismiss it, and she never fully came back to him after that. Daniel had told himself for years that he had done his best, that he hadn't known what to say, that he was a man of his generation, not built for those conversations. But sitting now in his quiet kitchen, thinking about Emily and the way she had looked at him when he said, you deserve more than just managing, he understood something he had been avoiding for a long time. He had known what to say. He had just been afraid to say it. He pulled out his phone, looked at Rebecca's name for a long moment, put it back down. Not yet. He wasn't ready yet. Instead, he opened his notebook and wrote down the name Carol had given him. Carol, the social worker, not his wife. though the coincidence of the name had not escaped him. Carol Simmons, someone who worked with families, someone who believed in keeping people together when the system's first instinct was to pull them apart. He would call her in the morning. He would do what he could. But even as he wrote the name down, a thought moved through him that he couldn't shake, quiet and uncomfortable, the way true things sometimes are. He was showing up for Emily's family the way he had never shown up for his own. He closed the notebook. Across the room, Rebecca laughed silently in the photograph. The next morning, Daniel made the call to Carol Simmons. What she told him set everything in motion, including something Daniel never saw coming. Chapter 7. The System Turns. Carol Simmons picked up on the second ring. She was the kind of person whose voice alone made you feel like the problem was already half solved. Steady, warm, practical. Daniel had known her for 11 years. She had worked family preservation cases in Millhaven longer than most people stayed in any job they actually cared about. He explained the situation carefully. The house on Elm Creek Road, Emily, Margaret, Lily, the heating, the medication. The baby coming soon. Carol listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Daniel," she said, "I have to tell you something before we go any further." He waited. "Garrett Webb got a call 2 days ago, an anonymous tip about that address." Daniel felt something drop in his chest. What kind of tip? Concerns about the living conditions. An elderly woman not receiving proper care. A minor left unsupervised. A pause. He's already opened a case. Garrett Webb. Daniel knew the name well. A supervisor with the county social services office, efficient by the book, and possessed of the particular certainty of a man who had never once doubted his own judgment. Webb didn't preserve families. He assessed them. And when they didn't meet his standard, he acted fast. "How much time do we have?" Daniel asked. "He's scheduling a formal home visit, probably within the week." Carol's voice was careful. "Daniel, I also need to ask you something directly. Did you delay filing a welfare report on this family?" The silence that followed was only a few seconds long, but it carried a great deal. "I was gathering information," Daniel said. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "Yes, I held it a few days." Carol exhaled slowly. "Webb knows. Someone flagged it. I don't know who. He's filing a formal complaint against you. Misconduct. Improper handling of a welfare case." Daniel stared at the wall. "He could push for a suspension," Carol continued. "Depending on how far he wants to take it, it could affect your pension, Daniel. 30 years of service. A pension he had counted on. A reputation built call by call, year by year, in a town where people remembered everything. All of it suddenly sitting on a very thin edge. He came to see me yesterday afternoon," Carol added. "He asked me directly if you had been making unofficial visits to the family. I told him I didn't have that information." "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." Her voice was firm but not unkind. "He said something else, Daniel. He said, and I'm telling you this because you need to hear it, he said if the home doesn't meet basic standards during the formal visit, he will move immediately to place Lily in temporary foster care." The words landed hard. Lily, 4 years old, worn shoes 2 sizes too big. "You come back, right?" "Carol, I know," she said quietly. "I know. What can we do? We have a few days, maybe 4, maybe 5. The house needs heat, the medication needs to be current, and Emily needs to understand what's coming so she isn't blindsided." A pause. "But Daniel, you need to be careful. If Webb thinks you're interfering with his case, it won't just be your pension at risk. It could discredit everything you're trying to do for that family." Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He had walked into harder situations than this. He had made harder calls. But those had been other people's lives. This felt different. Because somewhere between the grocery store and that kitchen table, and a little girl asking if he would come back, it had stopped being a case. Daniel had 4 days, and the clock was already running. Chapter 8. Lily Speaks. Daniel went to the house that same afternoon. He knew he was walking a fine line. Webb's complaint was sitting on someone's desk. Every unofficial visit was another line in a report that could be used against him. Carol had told him to be careful. He went anyway. Emily opened the door and read his expression immediately. "Something happened," she said. It wasn't a question. "Can I come in?" She stepped back. He told her plainly, the way he told everyone difficult things, without softening the edges so much that the shape disappeared. He told her about Webb, about the formal visit, about the 4 days. He didn't mention his own situation. That wasn't her weight to carry. Emily sat very still while he talked. When he finished, she looked at the middle distance for a moment, that familiar stillness, and then she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay. Not panic, not tears." The response of someone who had learned that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford. "We're going to work through this together," Daniel said. "Carol Simmons is going to help. She's on our side." Emily nodded again, then quietly. "What do they do if they decide to take Lily?" Daniel held her gaze. "We're going to make sure it doesn't come to that." It wasn't a guarantee. They both knew it. But it was something to stand on. From the hallway came the small sound of footsteps, unhurried, padding softly on the worn floor. Lily appeared in the doorway in her socks, holding a plastic toy horse with a missing tail. She looked at Daniel, then at Emily, then back at Daniel. She walked across the room, climbed up onto the couch beside him with the focused effort of someone scaling something important, and sat down close enough that her small shoulder touched his arm. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, turning the tailless horse over in her hands. Daniel looked down at her. Then across the room, near the kitchen sink, something was dripping. A slow, steady sound. The faucet he had noticed last week. Still not fixed. He stood. "Do you have a wrench?" Emily blinked. "What?" "The faucet. It's been dripping since my first visit. Do you have a wrench?" A beat of surprised silence. Then Emily almost smiled. Not quite, but close. "Under the sink, second cabinet." He found the wrench, got down on one knee in front of the sink and started working. The kitchen was quiet except for the occasional clink of metal and the soft sound of Lily narrating something to her toy horse in a low, serious voice. After a few minutes, Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. She watched him work with the same careful attention her sister used. Then she walked up beside him, crouched down to his level with the natural ease of a child, and watched the pipe the way a small engineer might inspect a problem. "Is it broken?" she asked. "Just a little loose," he said. "Sometimes things just need someone to pay attention to them." Lily considered this. "Like Grandma?" Daniel paused for just a moment. "Yeah," he said gently. "Like Grandma." Lily nodded as if this made complete sense. He tightened the last fitting and stood. The dripping had stopped. Lily tugged his sleeve. He looked down. "You come back, right?" she said. The same words as before. But this time she was looking straight at him. Not uncertain, not trembling. Just asking, clearly and directly the way children ask things when they genuinely need to know. Daniel crouched to her level. "Yes," he said. "I will." Lily studied his face for a moment, measuring the answer the way children do with something more accurate than logic. Then she held out the tailless horse. "You can hold Percy if you want," she said. "He helps." Daniel took the small plastic horse carefully in both hands. "Thank you, Lily." She nodded, very serious, very certain. He drove away that evening with a toy horse in his shirt pocket and 4 days on the clock. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet fear that 4 days might not be enough. Chapter 9. The Town Talks. The next morning, Millhaven did what small towns always do. It talked. Daniel heard it first from Mr. Elwood at the bakery, a careful sideways mention of that young girl on Elm Creek Road, and whether someone ought to be doing something. Then from Deputy Haynes at the station, who had heard from his wife, who had heard from someone at the pharmacy, who had mentioned the prescription that kept getting picked up and returned unpurchased. And then, at 10:15, a woman appeared at the station asking for Daniel by name. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was in her mid-70s, well-dressed, with the particular posture of someone who had spent a lifetime being correct. She sat across from Daniel's desk with her hands folded and explained, without a great deal of warmth, that she had been the one to make the anonymous call to social services. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I did it out of concern." Daniel looked at her steadily. "Tell me about that concern, Mrs. Calloway." "I live 4 houses down from the Turner property. I've watched that house for months." She paused. "I've seen that girl carrying groceries alone. I've seen the little one playing outside in the cold without a proper coat. I've seen the lights off for weeks." Her voice was composed, but something underneath it was less certain. "I thought someone needed to know." "Someone did know," Daniel said. "Me." A silence. "I didn't realize you were involved," she said. "I was handling it." Mrs. Calloway looked at her hands. For the first time, the composure slipped slightly. "I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to get involved directly. I thought the proper channels, Daniel said, keeping his voice even, may result in a 4-year-old girl being removed from the only family she has, because of an anonymous call that gave no context and left no room for the full picture." Mrs. Calloway was quiet for a long moment. When she looked up, something in her face had changed. "What can I do?" she asked. It was a small question, but it was the right one. Daniel leaned forward. "You can start by being present, not anonymous." By that afternoon, something shifted in Millhaven. Mrs. Calloway went home and called 3 women from her church. She told them what she had told Daniel, and what Daniel had told her. By evening, Mrs. Patterson from First Baptist had organized a meal delivery for the house on Elm Creek Road. A retired nurse named Gloria offered to check on Margaret twice a week. A hardware store owner named Ted, who had gone to school with Margaret's late husband, quietly arranged for the heating to be restored by end of day. Daniel heard about each of these things through separate phone calls. He sat with it for a moment, the way a small town, when it finally decided to see something, could move with surprising speed. But he also knew that warm meals and restored heating, while deeply meaningful, would not satisfy Garrett Webb. Webb wanted paperwork, standards, evidence of stability documented and filed correctly, and the formal visit was now 2 days away. Daniel called Carol. "The community is showing up," he told her. "Good," she said. "But Daniel, Webb called me again this morning. He's bringing a second assessor with him. He's not coming to help, he's coming to build a case." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Then we'd better make sure there's nothing for him to build with," he said. 2 days. A community that had finally woken up. And a man who had decided that doing things by the book had its limits, especially when the book had never been written with families like Emily's in mind. Chapter 10. Margaret's Harder Days. The heating came back on that evening. Ted's crew had it running by 7 o'clock. When the warmth began to move through the house on Elm Creek Road, Lily stood in the middle of the living room with both arms out and her eyes closed, just feeling it. Like something she had been waiting for without knowing how to ask. Emily watched her from the doorway. She didn't say anything. She just stood there with one hand resting on the frame, and for a moment her face held something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite sadness, but lived somewhere quietly between the two. Daniel noticed. He had stopped by to make sure the work was done properly. He stayed longer than he meant to. Margaret had been having a harder day. She had woken that morning not knowing what year it was. She had called out for people who weren't there. She had asked Emily twice about a doctor's appointment that had happened years ago, insisting it was today, growing frustrated when Emily gently redirected her. By afternoon she had settled, but the settling cost something. It always did. When Daniel arrived, Margaret was in her armchair, quieter than usual. She looked up when he came in and studied him with careful eyes. "I know you," she said slowly. "Yes, ma'am, Daniel Harper. We've met a few times now." She considered this. "You fix things." "I try to." She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already decided about him. Emily made tea. The three of them sat together in the warm living room, while Lily fell asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled to her chin and the tailless horse tucked under her arm. Daniel had returned Percy 2 visits ago, and Lily had decided he lived on the couch now. Margaret talked about her garden again, about the roses she had grown along the back fence for 20 years, about a summer when the whole neighborhood would stop to look at them. Then, mid-sentence, she stopped. She looked at her hands in her lap. "I forget things now," she said, not with distress, with a kind of plain honesty that was somehow harder to hear than distress would have been. "I know I do. I can feel the spaces where things used to be." The room was very quiet. "But I remember what matters," she continued. She looked at Emily. "I remember her, every version of her from the very beginning." Emily set down her cup very carefully. "And I remember—" Margaret paused, searching. Then something shifted in her expression. She looked around the room as if seeing it differently. "Where is she? Where's my daughter?" Emily went still. Daniel watched her face move through something private and difficult in the space of a single second, and then settle into that familiar steadiness. "She's not here right now, Grandma," Emily said gently. "But she's okay." Margaret looked at Emily for a long moment. Something uncertain moved through her eyes. Then she reached out and took Emily's hand. "You take good care of everyone," Margaret said softly. "You always have." Emily held her grandmother's hand and did not look away. But when Margaret dozed off a few minutes later, Emily stood and walked to the kitchen. Daniel followed. She stood at the sink with her back to him. Her shoulders rose once, a single contained breath. "She's getting worse," Emily said quietly. "I know she is." Daniel stood beside her. Not behind her. Beside. "I know," he said. "The visit is tomorrow." Her voice was steady, barely. "And I don't know if she'll have a good day or a hard one. I can't control that." "No," Daniel said. "But we'll be ready either way." Emily turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible and honest, and it said more than tears would have. "Why does this feel like everything is about to change?" she asked. Daniel held her gaze. "Because it is," he said gently. "But change isn't always the end of something. Sometimes it's the only way through." Tomorrow Garrett Webb would arrive at Elm Creek Road. And nothing, not the warmth, not the community, not Daniel's careful preparation, could guarantee how it would go. Chapter 11. A Letter from the Past. Emily couldn't sleep. It was past midnight. The house was warm now, really warm for the first time in weeks, and Lily was breathing softly in the next room, and Margaret had settled into a peaceful rest. Everything was as quiet as it was going to get. And still Emily sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, unable to close her eyes. The visit was in the morning. She had gone through everything twice. The medication was current. Mrs. Patterson had quietly covered the cost 2 days ago without making a production of it. The heating was running. The refrigerator had food in it. Carol Simmons had called that afternoon to walk her through what to expect, what to say, how to stay calm. Emily knew all of it. She had memorized it the way she memorized everything, carefully, completely, alone. But knowing something and feeling ready for it were 2 entirely different things. She pulled herself up and moved quietly through the house. She checked on Lily, checked on Margaret, stood in the hallway for a moment just listening to them breathe. Then she went to the closet where Margaret kept her important things, a shelf of labeled boxes that Margaret herself had organized years ago, in the precise and loving way of a woman who planned for the people she would leave behind. Emily had been through most of them, documents, photographs, small things kept for reasons only Margaret fully understood. But there was one box she had always set aside. She took it down now. Inside were letters, a small bundle, tied with kitchen string. The handwriting on the envelopes was familiar in the way that things are familiar when you've been avoiding them. Her mother's handwriting. Emily sat on the floor of the hallway and untied the string. She picked the oldest envelope first. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten, dated several years back. before everything had changed, before the distance, before the silence. She read it slowly. It wasn't a perfect letter. It wasn't a clean apology or a tidy explanation. It was a letter from a woman who was struggling and knew it, who loved her children with a fullness that was visible in every unsteady line, and who was asking, in the careful way of someone who doesn't feel entitled to ask, for a little more time. I know I haven't been what you needed. I know Margaret has carried more than her share because of me. I'm trying to find my way back. I don't know how long it will take. But I need you to know, you and Lily are why I'm still trying. Emily read that line 3 times. She set the letter down on her knee. She didn't cry. She sat with it, the way you sit with something that shifts the ground slightly beneath you without knocking you over. Then she noticed something at the bottom of the box, a name written on a small folded card in Margaret's handwriting. If anything ever happens, call Thomas Reardon. He promised. Emily stared at the name. She had never heard it before. Who was Thomas Reardon? And why had Margaret, in her careful and loving way, made sure that name survived everything else? Chapter 12. The baby moves. Emily was still sitting on the hallway floor when it happened. A movement, strong and sudden and unmistakable, like something reminding her it was there. She pressed her hand flat against her side and held very still. It happened again. She had felt small flutters before, quiet, uncertain things she could almost convince herself weren't real. But this was different. This was insistent, present, alive in a way that moved straight through all the exhaustion and worry, and landed somewhere she hadn't been able to reach in a very long time. She sat there in the quiet hallway with one hand on her side, and the card with Thomas Reardon's name in the other. And for a moment she didn't think about the visit tomorrow, or Webb, or the letter, or anything at all. She just felt it. Then, without fully deciding to, she reached for her phone and called Daniel. He picked up on the 3rd ring. His voice was alert, the voice of someone who hadn't been deeply asleep. "Emily, is everything okay?" "Yes," she said. Then, "I don't know. He moved. Really moved. For the first time." A brief silence, then, warmly, "That's a good thing." "I know." She paused. "I just didn't have anyone to tell." Daniel didn't say anything immediately. He let that sentence exist for a moment without rushing past it. They talked for a long time after that. Not about the visit, not about Webb or Carol or Thomas Reardon. Just talked. The way people talk late at night when the usual boundaries soften and the real things come forward. Emily asked him about his wife. Daniel told her about Carol, not the social worker, but his Carol. How she used to leave little notes in his jacket pockets so he'd find them during long shifts. How the house had felt like a different building after she was gone. Then he told her about Rebecca. He told it plainly. The night his daughter had come to him, the wrong things he had said, the distance that had grown from that moment like a slow, quiet tide. He got to the part where he wanted to say, "I wish I had done better," and he stopped. The silence held the rest of it. "You could still call her," Emily said. "I know," he said. "People can find their way back," she said quietly. "My mom's letter, she was trying, even when it didn't look like it from the outside." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You found the letters," he said. "Yes, and something else." She looked at the card in her hand. A name. Thomas Reardon. Margaret wrote it down like it was important, like she wanted me to find it. "Do you know who he is?" "No." "We'll find out," Daniel said. "Together." Emily leaned her head back against the wall. The baby moved again, softer this time, like a quiet confirmation. "Daniel," she said, "I want to fight for him, for Lily, for myself." A pause. "I haven't said that out loud before." "I know," he said gently. "I'm glad you did." Then his phone buzzed. He pulled it away for a moment, and when he came back, his voice had shifted, careful and steady in the way that meant something had changed. "Emily, Carol just sent a message. Webb moved the visit up. He's coming first thing in the morning." Emily closed her eyes. "How early?" she asked. 7 o'clock. It was already past 1 in the morning, and tomorrow everything would be decided. Chapter 13. Everything at Once. Daniel was on Elm Creek Road by 6:45. The morning was cold and pale, the kind of early light that makes everything look unfinished. He knocked twice. Emily opened the door already dressed, hair pulled back, eyes carrying the particular alertness of someone who had not slept but refused to show it. Margaret was having a calm morning. That was something. She sat in her armchair in a blue cardigan Emily had pressed the night before, hands folded, looking out the window at the frost on the grass with quiet interest. Lily was dressed and eating cereal at the kitchen table, Percy the horse stationed carefully beside her bowl. The house was warm, clean, as ready as it could be. At 7 o'clock exactly, 2 cars pulled into the gravel driveway. Garrett Webb stepped out first. He was a tall man in his 50s with the measured movements of someone who had learned to make authority visible without raising his voice. Behind him, a younger woman with a clipboard, the second assessor Carol had warned Daniel about. Daniel stood just inside the doorway. Webb saw him and stopped. "Officer Harper." His voice was flat. "You're not supposed to be here." "I'm a family friend," Daniel said evenly. "I have every right to be here." Webb held his gaze for a moment. Then he stepped inside. What followed was the longest hour Daniel could remember. Webb moved through the house with careful, clinical attention. He opened the refrigerator, checked the medication on the side table, asked Margaret direct questions in a tone that was professional and utterly without warmth. Margaret answered clearly at first. Then she grew uncertain. Not because anything was wrong, but because a stranger with a clipboard asking formal questions in her living room was exactly the kind of thing that unsettled her on even her best days. Emily stayed close to her grandmother. Calm, steady, answering Webb's questions for Margaret when needed, without apology. Daniel watched it all from across the room and said nothing. The younger assessor was in the hallway with Lily. Daniel could hear Lily's voice, matter of fact, unhurried, explaining to the woman that Percy had lost his tail in an accident, but was otherwise fine. Then Emily made a small sound, not loud, not dramatic, just a sharp intake of breath, and Daniel turned. She was holding the counter with both hands. Her face had gone very still. "Emily, something's wrong," she said quietly. "Something feels wrong." Daniel crossed the room in 4 steps. Webb looked up from his notes. Emily looked at Daniel with eyes that were frightened in a way he hadn't seen from her before. Not the managed fear of someone holding things together, but something raw and immediate. "The baby," she said. Everything shifted at once. Daniel had his phone out. Carol Simmons was already on her way. He had asked her to be nearby. He called for an ambulance. Webb stood in the middle of the living room looking, for the first time, uncertain. Lily appeared in the hallway and looked at her sister. She didn't cry. She walked to Emily and took her hand. "I'm here," Lily said simply. Emily gripped her little sister's hand and looked at Daniel. "Don't let them take her," she said. Her voice was steady, completely steady. "Please." Daniel looked at Webb directly. Webb looked at Emily, at Lily, at the small, warm house that a community had held together with quiet hands. He looked back at his clipboard, and for the first time since he had walked through the door, Garrett Webb said nothing at all. The ambulance was 4 minutes away, and in those 4 minutes, everything that had been building, every hard day, every quiet sacrifice, every small act of courage, was about to be tested all at once. Chapter 14. The night everything changed. The ambulance arrived at 7:53. Carol Simmons pulled in right behind it. Daniel made his choice in the space of a single breath. The kind of choice that doesn't feel like a choice at all, because only one answer is actually possible. He looked at Carol. "Stay with Margaret and Lily." Carol nodded once. She was already moving toward the living room. Daniel rode to the hospital with Emily. She didn't speak much on the way. She held the rail of the gurney with one hand and stared at the ceiling of the ambulance with focused, deliberate calm. The way she did everything, managing, holding, staying present through the force of pure will. Daniel sat beside her and didn't try to fill the silence. At one point she turned her head and looked at him. "You stayed," she said. I said I would. She turned back to the ceiling, but some of the tension in her shoulders released, just slightly, just enough. The baby was born at 2:17 that afternoon. He was small, several weeks early. He came into the world quietly, which frightened everyone for a moment. And then he found his voice, and the room shifted. Emily heard him and closed her eyes. The nurses worked quickly, efficiently, with the practiced calm of people who had done this many times. The baby was placed briefly near Emily's face before being moved to the neonatal unit. Just long enough for her to see him. Just long enough. He's beautiful, the nurse said. Emily didn't answer. She just looked at him with an expression Daniel had never seen on her face before. Completely unguarded, completely open. All the careful management gone. Just a mother seeing her child for the first time. By evening, Daniel was sitting in the hospital corridor outside the neonatal unit when Carol called. Webb had completed his assessment. He was recommending a 30-day monitoring period rather than immediate action. Carol had documented everything: the community support, the restored heating, the current medications, the stability of the household. The younger assessor had filed a note that the child, Lily, appeared well cared for and emotionally secure. It wasn't a clean resolution. 30 days meant 30 more days of uncertainty. But Lily was home. Daniel sat with that for a moment. Then the elevator opened and Emily appeared in a wheelchair, moved by a nurse to see the baby through the neonatal unit window. Beside her somehow was Lily. Carol had driven her over, understanding without being asked that this moment required the whole family. Lily pressed both hands flat against the glass. She studied her nephew with enormous, serious eyes. "He's tiny," she said. "Yes," Emily said softly. "Like me when I was little. Just like you." Lily thought about this carefully. Then she turned to Daniel with the direct certainty that was entirely her own. "Percy was tiny too," she said. "And he's okay." Daniel laughed. A real laugh, quiet and full. The kind that comes from somewhere that hasn't been reached in a long time. Emily looked at him, and for the first time since the grocery store, since the bench near the checkout lanes, since a cold afternoon that had changed the direction of everything, she smiled. Not managed, not careful, just real. The baby had no name yet. Emily said she needed to think about it, but Daniel noticed that she kept looking at the window long after Lily had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, and that whatever she was thinking, it settled something in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. Chapter 15. Seen at last. 3 weeks later, the baby came home. Emily named him James Margaret Turner. She told Daniel the name quietly, the morning of the discharge, while Lily was busy reorganizing the contents of the diaper bag with great personal authority. Emily said it simply, without ceremony, the way she said everything that truly mattered. Daniel nodded. He didn't trust his voice entirely in that moment, so he just nodded. The name Thomas Reardon had turned out to belong to Margaret's late husband's younger brother, a man in his 70s who lived in Ohio, and who, when Daniel tracked him down and called, went silent for a long moment before saying, "I've been waiting for that call for years." Thomas had known things were difficult. He had lost touch. He had told himself the distance was too great, the time too long, the gap too wide to cross. He had been wrong, and he knew it, and he said so plainly. He couldn't restore what time had taken, but he sent enough to hold the house on Elm Creek Road for 6 more months, quietly, without conditions, the way people give when they're trying to make something right rather than make themselves feel good about it. Margaret was settled in a care facility 20 minutes from Elm Creek Road. It was a modest place, clean and warm, with a garden along the south wall that would have roses in the spring. The staff knew her name by the 3rd day. Mrs. Patterson visited on Tuesdays. Gloria, the retired nurse, came on Fridays. Daniel came whenever he could. On his 3rd visit, Margaret didn't recognize Emily when she arrived. She looked at her granddaughter's face with searching, uncertain eyes. And then her gaze moved to Lily, standing close, holding baby James in careful arms the way Emily had taught her. Margaret's face opened completely. "There's my girl," she said softly. Emily watched her grandmother reach for Lily's hand and hold it, and she didn't look away. She stayed present with it, all of it, the joy and the ache of it together. Afterward, in the parking lot, she stood beside Daniel in the cold air. "She knew Lily," Emily said. "She did," Daniel said. A pause. "That's enough," Emily said quietly. "It has to be enough." And the way she said it, not defeated, not resigned, but settled, like someone who had finally put something heavy down, told Daniel that she meant it. Rebecca came the following weekend. She arrived unannounced, which was how Daniel knew she had actually decided to come rather than talked herself into it. She stood at his door with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at him for a long moment. "You called," she said. "I did," he said. "It only took 30 years. I know." She stepped inside. They sat at the kitchen table, the same chairs, and they talked, not easily, not without difficulty, but honestly, which was the thing they had never quite managed before. It wasn't a resolution. It was a beginning. And Daniel, who had spent a long time believing that some distances were permanent, found that he didn't believe that anymore. On a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after James came home, Daniel made his regular rounds through Hadley's family grocery. He nodded to Mr. Elwood, held the door for a woman with a stroller. He passed the wooden bench near the checkout lanes. He stopped, stood there for a moment in the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and felt the small plastic horse, Percy, tailless and worn and exactly right, that Lily had insisted he keep. "For when you need help," she had said. He smiled and he walked on. Some stories don't end with everything fixed. They end with people choosing to see and deciding that seeing is where everything begins. End of chapter 15. End of story.